Unveiling Scotland's hidden genetic tapestry. Scotland's history is often told as a simple story. Because when scientists began studying DNA across the British Isles, Scotland stood out, not for being uniform, but for being layered. Because this isn't just about history, it's about inheritance, about the DNA carried by millions of people today, often without realizing how many different sources it comes from. The idea is straightforward. Scotland was settled by Celtic peoples who brought their language, culture, and identity. Over time, that identity became the foundation of what we now recognize as Scottish. So even within Scotland, Celtic was never one thing. There were variations, differences between regions, different influences layered over time. But the simplified story tends to flatten those differences. It presents Scotland as if it emerged from one origin, one cultural source, one identity. And that creates a problem, because it hides what came before and what came after. Before the arrival of Celtic languages, Scotland was already inhabited by earlier populations, people whose genetic legacy still exists today. And after Celtic culture became established, other influences arrived. Vikings, Anglo-Saxon migrations, internal movement between regions. All of these added layers. But those layers are often treated as secondary, as additions to a core identity that is assumed to be Celtic. In reality, that core is only part of the story. The simplified version persists because it provides clarity. It gives people a clear origin, a clear label. But clarity is not the same as accuracy. And when modern DNA research looks at Scotland, it doesn't see a single origin. It sees overlap, multiple sources, a history that cannot be reduced to one identity. Long before the Celts, before clans, before recorded Scottish history, there were already people living on the land, and their genetic legacy still exists today. The earliest known inhabitants of what is now Scotland were hunter-gatherers who arrived after the last ice age, more than 10,000 years ago. As the ice retreated, these groups moved north into newly habitable land, bringing with them genetic traits that would form the deepest layer of Scotland's ancestry. Around 6,000 years ago, new groups began arriving, early farmers migrating from continental Europe. These populations brought agriculture, new technologies, and a different way of life. Ancient DNA studies from the British Isles show that early farmers carried different genetic signatures from the hunter-gatherers they encountered. Over time, these groups intermarried, creating a combined population with traits from both. This created a foundation, a genetic base that existed long before Celtic languages or identities appeared. And it didn't stop there. Later, during the Bronze Age, another major wave of migration reached Britain, often associated with steppe-related ancestry from Eastern Europe. These populations brought additional genetic variation, further reshaping the genetic landscape. This is what makes Scotland's genetic history so deep. It doesn't begin with the Celts. It begins thousands of years earlier, with multiple populations interacting over long periods of time. And even though cultural identities changed, languages shifted, societies evolved, the genetic foundation persisted. It was carried forward, quietly, through generations. So when we talk about Scottish DNA, we're not talking about a single origin. We're talking about a combination of ancient ancestries, some of which predate anything we usually associate with Scotland. And that changes how the story begins. Because the roots of Scotland are not just Celtic, they are much older. When Celtic culture arrived in what is now Scotland, it didn't create a new population. It reshaped an existing one. By the Iron Age, Celtic languages and cultural practices had spread across much of Britain, including Scotland. These influences came through movement, trade, and gradual cultural adoption, not necessarily through a single large migration that replaced the people already there. The people living there adopted Celtic languages, social structures, and identities. Over time, these became dominant. They shaped how communities organized themselves, how they communicated, and how they understood their place in the world. But genetically, the population was already mixed. The earlier layers, hunter-gatherers, early farmers, Bronze Age migrants, did not disappear. They remained. So the Celtic layer sits on top of something older, and it doesn't fully define what came before. This doesn't mean Celtic culture wasn't important. It was. It shaped identity, tradition, and history in profound ways. But it did not erase what came before, and it did not exist in isolation. There were also regional differences. The Highlands and Lowlands developed distinct cultural patterns over time. Different external influences reached different parts of Scotland. Coastal regions interacted more with seafaring groups. Inland areas maintained different traditions. So what we call Celtic Scotland is, in part, a reconstruction, a useful one, but still a simplification. And like all simplifications, it highlights some elements while obscuring others. In this case, it highlights cultural identity, but obscures genetic complexity, because beneath the Celtic layer, the deeper ancestry remains. And above it, new influences would soon arrive, adding even more layers to the story. Starting in the late 8th century, Norse groups from Scandinavia began moving into the British Isles. While some expeditions were short-term raids, others led to permanent settlements, especially in northern and coastal regions. Places like Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides became deeply connected to Norse culture. In some cases, they were effectively part of the Norse world for generations. Modern genetic studies show strong Scandinavian influence in parts of Scotland, especially in island regions. In places like Orkney, a substantial portion of the population's ancestry can be traced back to Norse settlers. But the influence didn't stay confined to the islands. Trade, movement, and interaction carried Norse ancestry into mainland Scotland as well. And as generations passed, those genetic contributions spread further. Another important point is that Viking expansion was not uniform. Different regions experienced different levels of Norse influence. The north and west were more heavily affected. Other areas, less so. This created regional variation within Scotland's genetic landscape. Some populations show stronger Scandinavian signals, others reflect more of the earlier layers. Over time, Norse settlers adopted local languages and customs. Their descendants became part of Scottish society. The distinction between Viking and Scottish began to fade. But the DNA remained. This is another example of how identity and genetics diverge. Historically, the Norse may have been seen as outsiders, but genetically, they became part of the population. And today, their legacy is still visible, not in obvious ways, but in patterns subtle traces within the broader genetic makeup of Scotland. Different regions developed their own identities: highlands, lowlands, islands. But those identities were not isolated from each other. People moved for trade, for survival, for conflict, and for opportunity. And wherever people move, they mix. The highlands and lowlands are often described as distinct worlds. Culturally, that's true. Different languages, different social structures, different historical experiences. But genetically, the boundary was never absolute. There was interaction, trade routes connected regions, conflicts displaced populations, families relocated over time. So while differences existed, they were not rigid. They shifted, blended, evolved. Another factor was migration within Scotland. Economic changes, environmental pressures, and political events all caused people to relocate. The Highland clearances, for example, forced many families to move from rural areas into cities or overseas. But even before that, smaller scale movements were happening constantly. Villages grew and declined, land changed hands, people adapted, and with each movement, genetic lines shifted, blended further. This internal mixing had an important effect. It reduced isolation. Even in regions that seemed culturally distinct, genetic exchange continued. So while Scotland may appear divided on the surface, highlands versus lowlands, island versus mainland, the underlying genetic picture is more connected, more fluid. A network rather than separate blocks. Modern DNA analysis has made it possible to look at populations across Scotland and compare genetic patterns in detail. What researchers find is not a single uniform profile. It's variation. But within that variation, there are consistent themes. At the same time, there are clear regional differences. Populations in the north and islands often show stronger Scandinavian signals, reflecting the legacy of Viking settlement. Other regions show different balances of ancestry, depending on historical interactions and migration patterns. Another key point is that Scottish DNA does not form a single, isolated category. It is closely related to other populations in the British Isles and parts of Northern Europe. There are shared genetic patterns with Ireland, Northern England, and even regions influenced by Norse expansion. This makes sense historically, because these regions were connected through movement, trade, and migration. This can be confusing, because people expect clear answers, a precise percentage, a defined origin. But DNA doesn't work that way. It reflects probability, similarity, shared history, not strict boundaries. Another important factor is scale. Over thousands of years, even small amounts of mixing can spread widely through a population. A genetic contribution from one group can become part of many different lineages over time. This is why certain patterns appear across large regions, not because everyone has the same ancestry, but because their ancestries intersect. If Scotland's genetic history is this layered, what does it mean for your own ancestry? It means it may be more complex than you think. If you have Scottish roots, whether recent or distant, you are not inheriting a single defined lineage. You are inheriting a combination of influences that have been building over thousands of years. This also explains why DNA results can feel unexpected. Someone may identify strongly as Scottish and still see Irish or Scandinavian components in their results. Another person with no known Scottish background may discover genetic links to Scotland. At first, this can seem confusing, but historically, it makes sense. Because populations across the British Isles and Northern Europe have been connected for centuries. People moved. They mixed. And those connections didn't stay within modern borders. They spread. This is especially true for Scottish ancestry outside Scotland. Large numbers of Scots migrated to other parts of the world, North America, Australia, and beyond. Over generations, they blended into new populations. Their identity may have changed, their DNA did not. So today, millions of people carry Scottish ancestry without necessarily recognizing it, not as a dominant identity, but as one layer among many. It may not appear in family stories, it may not be obvious in surnames, but it can still be there. So, if Scotland is part of your ancestry, it likely connects you to more than just one story. It connects you to layers, and those layers extend further back and further outward than most people expect. If Scotland's genetic history is this complex, why is it usually presented as something simple? Because simplicity is easier to tell. History, especially in education, tends to favor clear narratives. One origin, one identity, one dominant story that people can understand and remember. Celtic Scotland fits that model. It provides a clear label, a clear image. But complexity doesn't fit as easily. Multiple layers, overlapping ancestries, gradual mixing over thousands of years, these are harder to explain and harder to teach, so they are often reduced. There's also the role of identity. Nations tend to emphasize distinct origins. Clear cultural lines help define belonging, history, and tradition. A more complex genetic picture, one that shows blending and shared ancestry, can blur those boundaries. So the focus stays on what separates, not what connects. And for a long time, there was another limitation: evidence. Without modern DNA analysis, it was difficult to see these patterns clearly. The historical record could suggest movement and interaction, but it couldn't measure their long-term impact. Now it can. And what it reveals is simple. Scotland was never one thing. It was always many. All of it remains, not always visible, but still present, carried forward in DNA. And once you see that, the idea of a single Scottish origin disappears, replaced by something more accurate. A network of ancestry, a history built from multiple sources, layered over time. And if you have Scottish roots, that complexity is part of your story too, even if you've never been told. Because ancestry isn't just what's recorded, it's what's inherited. And sometimes, the most important parts are the ones that were never fully explained. If you found this interesting, subscribe for more videos. See you